Sorry about the long intro there. That was Bootsy Collins with I'd Rather Be With You. I was rather enjoying that and didn't want to cut that off. Welcome to a British Audiophile, and this episode in which I'm sharing with you my experiences of living with this thing, the Hegel H160 Amplifier. So Hegel's built itself up quite a reputation in recent years amongst the audiophile community and the industry for producing some excellent amplifiers. This amplifier in particular, the H160, has been very favourably reviewed in some very prestigious publications. Herb Reichart of Stereophile described its sound as visceral and ardent. Alan Sercombe at Hi-Fi Plus also reviewed it very favourably, as did the Absolute Sound. In 2016, it won European Amplifier of the Year in the ISA Awards. And there's been all sorts of hype and claims that this basically knocks the socks of everything in its class and can compete with amplifiers at £10,000–20,000. So what's been my experience of living with this for the last 6 months, and does it live up to the hype? Well, let's get into that now. Let's take a look at the front of this amplifier. So you have an input selector, a big OLED display, and a volume control that goes up in dB steps from 0 to 100, and a headphone jack. Not much to see on the front, and the power switch is here underneath, hidden away. The overall design, I think it's kind of minimal and utilitarian. I don't think it's the most stylish in the world. I think certainly the Italians probably would have come up with something with a bit more flair. Disconnect this power lead and spin this round. Oh, that's heavy. It's about 17 kgs. The packed weight is 19. So across here you have your line level outputs. This is a fixed output, so if you want to use this as purely a DAC, although I can't understand why you'd want to do that, that's what that's for. This is your preamplifier output that could be used to connect to a subwoofer or an external power amplifier. You have a home theatre input to analog input here. I think that can be configured to a traditional line level input as well, and you have one traditional line level analog input. There's a balanced XLR input, some very good quality speaker binding posts here, coaxial digital output from the DAC, 3 optical outs. I don't know why they've got 3. I think it would have been nicer to have maybe 2 optical and 2 coax, or 2 optical and 2 USB. That's your USB connection, and that's your Ethernet connection, because this can also be connected via Ethernet to your router and act as effectively a streamer, and your ISE power connection. Let's take a look inside. Okay, so I'm going to go handheld for this section where we take a quick look inside the Hegel H160. That blackboard, I'm not sure if you can see it, maybe better from an angle. That is the DAC board. I'm not sure what that green board on top of it is. That might be something to do with the streaming module. It's got heavy shielding on it, so I can't see what's on there, but that's essentially the DAC board, perhaps with the streamer. A very large power transformer. I can't see the VA rating on there. That label doesn't say what it is. Certainly isn't 250 VA. I should imagine it's 400, 500 VA power transformer. 6 power supply capacitors, I should say. And yeah, they're rated at 10,000 each, so that's a total of 60,000 microfarads, which is about right, I suppose. Is what you'd expect an amplifier at this level. And that's your current reserve, essentially. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I can get them all in, there you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bipolar transistors that are mounted to that heatsink. Those are your output transistors. The board itself is pretty complicated. There's quite a lot of circuitry there. Just zoom in here and get the angle right. You can see all those little R30s, R39, C22. They're basically surface mount. The tiny little ones are surface mount components, and the bigger ones that you can see sticking out are discrete components. So it's not a fully discrete design. It's partly discrete, partly surface mount. Obviously, fully discrete would be better, but more expensive. Heatsink's about the size you'd expect. Its reputation is to be quite a reliable amplifier. There's not many returns from what dealers say, so a well-engineered product at its price point. So let's start by looking at the design goals that Bent Holter, the CEO, founder and chief engineer of Hegel, had for this amplifier. The idea was to produce an amplifier that added nothing, had no coloration. The philosophy is that you choose the flavor of music you want by choosing your speakers, and the amplifier just does its job and gets out of the way. So they wanted to produce an amplifier that had class-leading performance, and in order to achieve that, it needed to have very low distortion, excellent dynamics, and basically a one-box solution that could compete with amplifiers at this price point and pre-power amplifiers at price points above. I'll get into whether he achieved those design goals at the end. I want to talk about Hegel's sound engine technology. A lot of how this amplifier sounds is attributed to that patented technology, and it claims to solve two problems traditionally associated with Class AB amplifiers. The first is that in order to control levels of distortion in a traditional Class AB amplifier, negative feedback is used. Now, negative feedback works very effectively at low and mid frequencies, but is less effective at high frequencies due to something called global feedback delay. The second problem associated traditionally with Class AB amplifiers is crossover distortion. Now, that's where you have two transistors, one dealing with the negative side of the signal and the other one dealing with the positive side of the signal. And as one transistor hands over to another transistor, there can be a delay or an overlap, and that basically is crossover distortion. In order to solve that problem, traditionally what you do is apply a small amount of bias current, and then that crossover becomes smoother. Now, Bent Holter claims that due to the asymmetrical nature of a music signal, that transistors basically vary in temperature, and due to the variation in temperature, those biasing conditions of the transistor become suboptimal, and as a result you don't have the correct bias at all given times within the amplifier depending on the operating temperature of that transistor. Both of these problems are supposed to have been solved by the sound engine technology inside this amplifier. What that essentially is a feed-forward system where they take a sample of the signal, put it through an analog computer. It works similarly to the way in which, say, common mode rejection works in balanced XLR cables or noise cancelling headphones, and essentially they can isolate the distortion and deduct it from the signal in a feed-forward system. The other significant benefit of having this feed-forward system is that it greatly improves the damping factor. Now, the damping factor is effectively the output impedance of this amplifier, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. Now, the job of an amplifier is to control the speaker, and it does so by supplying power, and in particular the right amount of current as the load of the speaker changes. Speaker loads can change from anything from 16 ohms to 2 ohms, and the amount of current that is required to be delivered from the amplifier has to change accordingly. But a speaker is essentially a coil surrounded by a magnet, and as that coil moves in and out, it generates something called a back EMF. That's essentially the principle by which electricity generation works. You have, in a electrical generator, you have a whole series of magnets and a coil, and you move one, and that is basically Faraday's laws in terms of how you produce electricity. So what I'm basically saying is that the speaker also tries to control the amplifier by producing this back EMF. Essentially, how much the amplifier controls the speaker and how much the speaker controls the amplifier is determined by the relative impedances of the two. So typical speaker may have an impedance of somewhere between 4 and 8 ohms. You want the amplifier to have an impedance of, traditionally you would probably accept a few hundred times less than the speaker. Well, this amplifier has a damping factor, or that ratio is in excess of 1,000, so a damping factor of 1,000, and the newer versions of this claim to have damping factors up to 4,000. So theoretically they should exert a very high degree of control over that speaker. That's the amplifier section, but this amplifier also has a built-in DAC, and not any old DAC, a good DAC for that matter. It's based on the outgoing HD11 model, which itself as a standalone DAC retailed for £1,000. Okay, so you haven't got the chassis and the power supply, so you could consider this £2,500 amplifier a £2,000 amplifier with a £500 built-in DAC module. What's interesting about the DAC? Well, it centers around the AKM 32-bit chip, but what's particularly interesting to me is that it uses a linear phase filter, an FIR filter. I'm not going to get into the details of different types of finite impulse response and infinite impulse response filters, because that's a whole new topic. But what's important to note about this particular filter is it optimizes phase response, which basically means it optimizes transient response across all frequencies, as opposed to amplitude response across that frequency range. So it's designed to be very quick and very fast, and it's sacrificing that in preference from a particularly totally flat linear response. One of the strange things about this DAC is that the USB input is limited to 24-bit 96 kilohertz, so it can't play my 192 or 176 resolution files. Right, so let's get on to what everybody probably really wants to know about. What's my impression of what this thing sounds like? Now, my fundamental impression of this amplifier is that it's very clean, very fast, but also slightly lean. Now, I'm acutely aware that this is in perhaps direct conflict of where Herb Reichart and to some extent John Darko landed with this amplifier. Herb described this amplifier as ardent and visceral, and that's a long way away from fast, clean and lean. So, and also John Darko described the H590 in fairness as very rich and full. He said it was less so the case with the 190, but the 190 is basically the updated version of this amplifier. So who's right, who's wrong? Well, I think this is where it depends on the type of music you listen to and your system to some extent. If you listen to a lot of rock and a lot of large-scale classical works or big orchestral music, the speed and the articulation and the control of this amplifier really comes into play, especially at louder volumes, because it plays very loud and very clean. However, if you listen at lower volume levels and you listen to kind of more relaxed music, that's where the lean character comes in. And I'll explain when I talk a little bit more detail about the strengths and weaknesses of this amplifier. That very high damping factor also has a very tight grip on your woofer in particular, and it depends on some extent as to how much bass output your speakers generate. If you've got speakers that generate a lot of bass and are slightly flabby in their bass response, this is going to really sing because it has a very tight grip on that woofer. However, if you've got speakers that are slightly less bloated in the bass and have less bass input, like the Proax I have behind me, they only have a 5-inch woofer and they produce a limited amount of bass, and what bass they do produce is generally well controlled. This amplifier, I suspect, over dampens that woofer. Now that's a bit like having the suspension in your car overly damped. It's going to result in an overly firm ride, and that's what I think is essentially happening here. If you've got speakers that produce limited bass or are very tight in the bass, this amplifier is over dampening them, controlling them a bit too tightly. So it's suited to speakers perhaps which are larger with bigger woofers. So what are the strengths and relative weaknesses of this amplifier? Well, the treble response and the upper mids are superb, the best I've actually heard at anywhere near this price point. And that has to be attributed to the sound engine technology. There's something in it. It's definitely doing its job in terms of eliminating distortion at those upper registers. Female vocals, strings, guitars are produced really in exquisite detail. It also has excellent transient response. The leading edge of notes are extremely well defined, and it's a very fast amplifier that keeps pace with the rhythm superbly well. Its other great strength is that it plays very loud and very clean. I think that's where really the power comes into its own. This produces 150 watts into 8 ohms and 250 watts into 4 ohms, and I think rock fans and classical musical fans that play big orchestral works will be very well served by this amplifier. So what are the weaknesses of this amplifier? Well, at lower volumes it lacks a little bit of life, and I put that down to a lack of weight and body in that bass response, and I think that's probably attributed to, in my system, an overly damped woofer in combination with this amplifier. The bass that is there is extremely articulate, it's very fast, but as I say, it just lacks that little bit of weight and authority, and it robs you of ultimate dynamics. It renders male vocals, certainly kind of like the blues performers that sometimes I like to listen to, B.B. King, John Lee Hooker, Muddy Waters. It robs them of that little bit of authority and weight in their voice. Kick drums don't quite hit as hard as perhaps I'd like as well. The overall resolution is very good, and the timing is excellent of the amplifier and the DAC, and in comparison to the Mojo, it's a comparable quality of DAC. The Mojo is a slightly softer, warmer sound again. In terms of ultimate resolution, I'd probably give it the edge to the Hegel. So in conclusion, did Bent Holter achieve his design goals? The objective was to produce a one-box amplifier that could compete with pre-power amplifiers at this price point and above. Well, certainly could compete with any pre-power at this price point, but at £5,000, I think there'll be better amplifiers out there. At £10,000, forget about it. There's loads of amplifiers that will see this off with a clean pair of heels. The other objective was to produce an amplifier that added nothing, had no coloration. Well, I'm not even sure if that's possible. This amplifier doesn't have any particularly obvious coloration. It's very clean, very highly resolving, but it does tend to lean on the slightly analytical lean side of neutral. Does it produce class-leading performance? I think Name, Arcam, Rager would have to go some to try and better this amplifier for the same kind of money, and I can understand why some Name enthusiasts have switched over to Hegel, because it offers perhaps better value. A little word of caution here. This amplifier retailed for £2,450, and I think at that price point represented excellent value. It's since been replaced by the Hegel H190, which retails for £3,200. That's a 30% increase. Now, I know the Hegel H190 has version 2 of the sound engine, but still that's a substantial increase for what is essentially the same amplifier. So I'm just curious as to whether Hegel have decided to cash in on their reputation and success with this amplifier and the ones that preceded this. How does this amplifier compare to other amplifiers that I have here? Well, I tested it in an A/B comparison with my Exposure 21 preamp and 18 monoblocks. Now the Exposures are 25 years old. They retailed back then for about £3,000. So allowing for inflation, you could argue there'd be circa £5,000 today. But fabrication processes in electronics and other technological advances have also happened in the last 25 years. I personally think that the Exposure perhaps still represents a class above and is probably more comparable to amplifiers at that £4,000–5,000 price point. As a result, the Exposure has greater dynamics, has a much bigger soundstage, it's a little bit more resolving. The bass frequencies are fuller and deeper, and the mid-range has a lot more tonality, and there's a little bit better separation and space around instruments. Imaging is excellent on both of them. In terms of transient response, the Hegel is better. It's quicker with those leading edges, it's faster sounding, and also that treble response on that Hegel is excellent. It's better than the Exposure. I've also got an Audiolab QDAC, which is basically a stripped down version of the NDAC. It's basically got less features, essentially the same output stage and slightly different chip inside, but let's call the QDAC, if you're not that familiar, kind of like a MDAC Lite, and the M Power, which retailed for around £500, which is a 40-watt small power amplifier. So that's a DAC power amplifier combination in two separate boxes, which retails for about £900, or it did retail for about £900 4 or 5 years ago. The Hegel represents a significant class improvement, at least one level, if not two above, and is better in every regard than the Audiolab. Although the Audiolab, I think, is a good performer for its particular price category, but you see what you get extra when you spend 2.5 times the money. It's better detail, better resolution, better transients, better bass, better mids, better highs. It's just better across the board. So hopefully you've got something from this review, and I'm hopefully looking to do some more in the next coming weeks. And don't forget to share, like, subscribe, do all that wonderful social media stuff. But for now, for today, a British audiophile signing off.